sipping on love. All you need to know, baby girl.
Just a few months ago, Harvard College opted to rename its housemasters as faculty deans after students of color suggested that the term master had ties to slavery. Yale students also recently rallied against the name of one of its residential colleges, which was named after John Calhoun, a known slaveholder. Even Princeton struggled to make amends with students of color, who earlier in the year demanded that the name change of the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs and Public Policy, or as we like to call it, Woody Woo, because of Wilson's known racist tendencies despite his connections and contributions to Princeton. We've also had sit-ins in President Eisgruber's office, Black Lives Matter protests, and so on. In short, racial tensions are definitely having an impact on students of color here at Princeton and across the nation. All of these incidents have sparked a sort of national dialogue, though, on racial tensions on college campuses. Perhaps the most important result of this is that all of this talk of racial tensions and the discomfort of students of color brings to question how the university can accommodate students of color and promote inclusion. Prospect House is often regarded by the wider university community as a gathering spot for community engagement and inclusion. In essence, a space that all students, students of color included, can come to get involved in the Princeton community without the inhibition of ongoing racial tensions. However, the Prospect House itself has a history rooted in racism, slavery, and overall racial tensions, which we'll look at more in depth later on. How then does the Prospect House's history impact the comfort or discomfort and sense of belonging or unbelonging of Princeton students of color? Prospect House was built in 1850 as a summer home for James Potter, a slave owner from Charleston, South Carolina, and the rest of his family. When the Potters came to stay in Prospect House, they would bring along their slaves with them, essentially creating a pseudo-plantation, or at least the social dynamic of one, in Princeton. The house, which was passed down in the Potter family and underwent many renovations during the time, eventually ended up in the hands of the university by means of an extremely generous donation in 1878. Soon after this happened, University President James McCosh fell in love with the place, so he declared Prospect House the official residence of the university president. Quite a few presidents after McCosh resided in Prospect House, 7 in total, including perhaps the most notable resident and past university president, Woodrow Wilson. After Wilson and a few other university presidents came and left the Prospect House, it was transformed from the president's residence to a faculty club, and now serves as a sort of reception hall for fancy dinners where students get to dine and converse with revered lecturers, dignitaries, and similar guests. From past to present, the history of Prospect House, no matter how much it has changed over time, continues to impact students of color. Let's start by taking a look at Woodrow Wilson's influence on Prospect House. Woodrow Wilson was often hailed the perfect Princeton man, the quintessence of leadership, if you will. And while the praises he received don't come without their merits, Wilson's fans, up until recent campus discussions about his legacy, sort of just overlooked his racist tendencies. Wilson was a segregationist, especially concerning federal agencies and Oval Office decisions, and he implemented policies that in many ways reversed the tide of race relations and civil rights in a very negative way. Nevertheless, Wilson was an extremely revered figure at Princeton, and his achievements were championed and celebrated on campus, and arguably continue to be to this day, at the expense of students of color. Of course, the very fact that Wilson resided in Prospect House might create a sense of discomfort for students of color, but his legacy actually had a lasting, concrete impact on the Prospect House as well. In one of the dining rooms in Prospect House, an entire bookcase is filled with books of Wilson's policies and ideas, serving as a constant reminder of the Prospect House's past and its ties to Wilson's blatantly racist ideals. The books are preserved and deemed historic, and as a result, segregation and racism quite literally still live in Prospect House. Old yearbooks filled with pictures of all white students also line the walls of the dining rooms, further reminding students of color of their displacement and alienation. Wilson's residence and continuous physical presence in the Prospect House reinforces the sentiment that the Prospect House is a place of separation, of an unwelcoming dynamic to students of color that was first established upon Prospect House founding, only to be continued through Wilson's forthright racism. The very way that the Prospect House operates can evoke discomfort in students of color, drawing ties back to the racist dynamic that the house was founded upon. Earlier in FSI, I had the opportunity in my pole class to attend a luncheon with a guest lecturer in none other than the Prospect House. Sure, the lunch was nice, a bit overdone, but nice, but immediately I noticed an aspect of the lunch that was intended not to be noticed: the servers. They meekly, ever so quietly, came in and out of the dining room, systematically dropping off plates, drinks, platters, and more, all without ever being acknowledged by the diners, us. The way we seemed to ignore their presence and be so dismissive of them was the norm. It was just one of those things you'd expect to happen at the Prospect House, I suppose. However customary, the way these servers, who happen to be of color, were treated parallels the pseudo plantation power dynamic that I keep referring to, one in which we, the diners, have power over subservient people of color, the servers. A racist system almost reminiscent of slavery. This parallel brings forth the racist history of Prospect House, even in the most contemporary setting possible. But it doesn't end there. The very act of dining in the Prospect House is one that comes with a certain etiquette and demeanor that's likely to be foreign to students of color who may have never dined under such circumstances. Going back to my luncheon for pole, I remember being surprised, confused, even caught off guard at the number of courses that were being served, the number of forks and knives on the table, and even the nature of small talk being passed around by the adults at the table. And I know many of my fellow FSIers, had never dined like this. Culturally, we felt like total outsiders. While of course the color of our skin had no bearing on whether or not we were invited to attend the luncheon, there were unspoken barriers in place, discomforting us because of our upbringings, our cultures. They were different as students of color. This unfamiliarity with the dining culture, I guess you could say, of Prospect House and of the upper white class was yet another way that we, students of color, felt alienated. Looking back onto Einstein's Out of My Later Years, in which he emphasized sociability and the approval of peers as key in one's education, it seems as though the Prospect House isn't letting students of color get the most out of their education. At least, Einstein wouldn't think so. Students of color there are alienated by inherent racial barriers, which prevent them from effectively taking part in community-wide discussions and being included. So sure, Prospect House changed a lot as it shifted hands from the Potters to Princeton University and with the tides of time, but the foundation of the Prospect House as a pseudo-plantation, rooted in racism, is a facet of the house's history that simply can't be reversed or erased. In fact, this foundational aspect of the house continues to be present even as today's students of color walk through the looming front doors of the house. In a time when inclusion is especially pertinent on college campuses, the wider Princeton community likes to regard the Prospect House as a place for all students to be able to come together, to engage with one another, to learn and discuss as a scholarly community. And while this has been achieved in many respects, the history of Prospect House, its founding by slaveholders, its relations to Woodrow Wilson's racist sentiments, and even current practices, hold an inescapable extent of power over students of color, which causes these students to question their belonging and legitimacy in the university community. And while not all students of color feel immediately and deeply alienated and discomforted because of this history, or perhaps they don't even know about this history, it's undeniable that the Prospect House's history does not facilitate the comfort or the sense of belonging of Princeton's students of color.